and I commend it to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by praising the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, the Minister responsible for this legislation, and say it is an absolute pleasure for me to be standing in this House and supporting it. Mr. Speaker, I just want to give a little background to the frustration that we on this side of the House are feeling, not about the content of the legislation, but the fact that had it had been introduced when the Select Committee recommended and the House understood it was to be progressed, New Zealand taxpayer would be $50 million better off. And I bet every single person in this House would think of a really good use for $50 million, a better use for $50 million than cleaning up oil on the beaches of Papamoa and Makatu, as Brendan Horan has so graphically illustrated. In my electorate, we could have a lot of fences between my constituents' homes and the rocks that are making their houses unsafe. $50 million would actually protect the whole lot of them. They could all go back and live in their homes instead of living in horrible garages and caravans as they currently are. But, Mr. Speaker, that is not to undermine the excellent quality of this. Mr. Okenvold and his colleague from Auckland, who's Mr. Ross, I think, Lee Ross, didn't seem to realise that actually the reason... I was right the first time. Well, there you are. It's very confusing when you have so many names. I'm sorry about that. So, didn't seem to realise about the international conventions that this legislation puts into practice. So the Bunker Oil Convention is the critical one, and that didn't come into force till 2008. So it was not actually possible for legislation to have been introduced under the Labour-led government of the time. The Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee looked at that convention, reported back into the House and said it should be passed into law. The incoming minister at the end of 2008... Mr. Speaker, the incoming Minister of Transport got a briefing which said this legislation is ready to go, it should be introduced so that we could update the Maritime Transport Act in 2009. For some reason, and I'm sure that members in the House will ask the Honourable Stephen Joyce what his reason for not progressing it was, but for some reason the government chose to not progress with legislation which had already been considered in the convention consideration of the Select Committee and which was ready to go. So that was 2009. Early on in the piece, we know what happened. On the 5th of October 2011, the RENA ran aground on the Estrella Reef. Jamie Lee Ross, if I say it like that, I'm sure I'll get the combination of first names and second names correct. He basically said, well, we weren't steering the RENA, we didn't ride it onto the reef, it wasn't the government's fault. Well, nobody said it was, actually. I remember Stephen Joyce raising the same point at the time. What we said then, and continue to say now, is had the government done the right thing and passed the legislation which was ready to go, then the people who were in control of that situation would have been liable for the costs. And actually, it's only a percentage of the costs, because I've been there and seen what damage it did to the communities. I know that people who rely on seafood as part of their culture and way of life were devastated by what had happened to their surrounding areas. I know that the people who operated the tourism facilities in Tauranga, Papamoa, the Mount, in those areas, were devastated that their livelihood was threatened by something that they weren't even sure they were going to get compensation for. Thank goodness the government came to the party and supported those businesses, but they weren't required to. It was goodwill, and I want to acknowledge the government for doing that. But the point that Labour and the Greens and New Zealand First have been making is that this legislation could have protected the taxpayers, was all ready to go, had been worked on, and was totally ignored by the government. And we can't understand that. what has the Minister of Transport and his predecessor been doing for the last 4 years if they couldn't progress a bill which not only was ready to go, but had cross-party support in this Parliament? Mr. Speaker, the second part of this bill is an amendment to the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Act of 2012. And it's really interesting that when you look at the fact that we've been waiting for 4 years for this bill to come in to protect us against damage such as occurred with the Rena reefing, and yet the second part of this very same bill has got 37 pages of amendments, 37 pages of amendments to the EZ Act, to a bill that we just passed a matter of weeks ago. How can it be that a bill that has just gone through this Parliament, not rammed through under urgency, went through a proper select committee process, did not get support from our party because the very point of it was not achieved in the legislation? Numerous amendments were ignored by the Minister and subsequently by her colleagues. Great efforts were made for a bipartisan approach, a multi-party approach would have followed in terms of the EZ legislation, because we considered it was something too important to just override for some sort of petty political point scoring. But the Minister went ahead and said, no, I'm not going to alter it, I'll just go ahead. And now, just a matter of weeks later, we see 37 pages of amendments. Mr. Speaker, I think that's a bit of an indictment, really, on the shambles of process that this government has been operating under. The Minister of Transport is clearly not on top of this bit of work. The fact that it has taken him so long to get it out of the cupboard and into the House has cost us $50 million when the government day in, day out tells us about cuts to frontline services that we have to put up with in our constituencies because there's not enough money, and here they are frittering away $50 million because they couldn't get it onto the order paper fast enough. That is just bad management, actually. It's bad House management, it's a shambles, and it reflects very poorly on the Minister. The Minister for the Environment has an equally poor reflection cast on her in this legislation. 37 pages of amendments to a bill on which the ink has hardly dried. It was only in the last session that this Parliament was debating that legislation. Mr. Speaker, I just want to conclude by acknowledging the criticism, I suppose, that perhaps was a little unfair, that Chris Okenvoll, who spoke immediately prior to me, talked about in relation to Brendan Horan's speech. He said that Mr. Horan had got quite obsessed with minutiae. And I know that a number of my colleagues have been discussing this very point at some length today. I know that Richard Prosser, Brendan Horan's colleague, has been tweeting about that very subject and has made awards on this minutiae subject. So I want to just acknowledge Mr. Speaker, who, not the current Speaker in the Chair, but our regular Speaker. I also want to acknowledge H.V. Ross Robertson and Alfred Narrow, who are three of the male members of the House who are wearing their new ties today and who look extraordinarily dashing in their ties, if I might just say. So thank you, Mr. Okenvoll, for acknowledging that. Mr. Speaker, it's great. I beg your pardon. At the risk of being named and sent from the chamber, can I also, Mr. Speaker, acknowledge your extraordinary classy tie and say how well it looks on you. Mr. Speaker, seriously, it is really good to be able to support this legislation. I'm disappointed that it's taken so long to come before the House, but I look forward to its speedy progress and through to its passing.
Scott Simpson.
Mr. Speaker, it's a great